It's a really great pleasure for me to welcome from Alaska Dr. Dalee Sambo Dorough, professor, lawyer, and Inuit activist. Many, many years ago, about 30, 35 years ago, I was sitting in the ICC office in New Greenland, and in comes this young student. She says, I just finished high school, so I came here and I want to work for the rights of Inuit. Wonderful. And she did that ever since. Since those early days, Dalee Sambo Dorough has fought tirelessly for Inuit rights at the UN, where she was chair in 2014 at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and also through her multi-year work with the International Inuit Organization, ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represents the world's 180,000 Inuit. She was elected as the international chair of ICC in 2018 and continues her work. Please welcome Dalee Sambo Dorough.
Piana, thank you very much, Mariana, and I'm really appreciative of the invitation, but also the introduction. Mariana is quite right. We've known each other for decades now. I raised that in a recent conversation. She said, let's not go into how long it has been, but some of the remarks that I'll make go back to the early time that Mariana assisted the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And today I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation to highlight the linkage between Indigenous knowledge and human rights, and really underscore the human rights that are the foundation upon which today in the contemporary world, Indigenous knowledge is important, and to amplify that a bit more. It's honestly difficult to follow such a serious discussion about the difficult dialogues that need to take place about children and Inuit children. So I applaud the work of Aviaya and others doing this difficult work. So, and now to get into something more cerebral, I'll talk about human rights and Indigenous knowledge in particular, and the important linkage. As I've noted, I've entitled this presentation, Indigenous Knowledge and the Need for a Human Rights Framework. At the outset, I think it's important to acknowledge the extraordinary amount of work that was done decades ago by the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and in particular, the recognized founder of the ICC, Eben Hobson. If you look back at some of the important speeches that Hobson provided, you will see that we were consistently speaking about these particular issues well before they became vogue. And everyone knows that the Arctic is now a part of the geopolitical and geostrategic dialogue taking place across the globe, and that states far from us are now engaged and interested in Arctic issues, of course, primarily for commodities, but I think that for me, it's important to recognize the long-standing work of the organization in areas that no one really ever thought about. And to me, it's also significant that much of this was thought about in terms of rights and human rights. And Hobson made specific reference in 1977 when he welcomed delegates to the first organizing conference of the Inuit in Utqiagvik, Alaska, or formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. In his welcoming address, Hobson stated that our language contains the memory of 4,000 years of human survival through the conservation and good managing of our Arctic wealth. Our language contains the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate. Without our central involvement, there can be no safe and responsible Arctic resource development. Significantly, we're still saying the same thing. And Hobson's words speak volumes about the host of issues that he was tangling with in the midst of impending offshore oil and gas development. But his reference to the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate continues to be a matter of fact and science today. In the earliest days, and this is the reference I made earlier about the assistance of Mariana Stenbeck and others to prepare the principle and elements for a comprehensive Arctic policy. Today, the 8 Arctic states, states across the globe are adopting Arctic policies and have a strategic plan for their activities in the Arctic. This work began in the early 80s, and I think it is, again, significant that these sentiments and the substance of the early comprehensive Arctic policy principles and elements have rung true and influenced so many other developments. The preamble of the original policy underscored that we want to contribute our knowledge in order to improve conditions for humanity, for common security of all peoples and states, and for world peace. In addition, the linkage to environmental issues was made very clear that our activities should not only meet local needs, but also encourage self-reliance, and that they be culturally appropriate in terms of any of the activities or development that's taking place in the Arctic region. In the context of a discussion in those elements and principles related to renewable resource management, there was a very unequivocal statement that Inuit are an integral part of Arctic ecosystems, that we have this profound relationship between us and all living species to the natural world, and that it has economic, social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions. To me, this is huge, but it also underscores, like the nature of human rights, the interrelated dimensions of our way of life, our way of being, as well as Indigenous knowledge, that intricate knowledge that Hobson spoke of. In addition, under the section concerning renewable resource management, there was an effort to highlight our way of life in terms of the traditions, customs, and rules relating to harvesting and resource management. And significantly, the knowledge of our people, their experience, and the input from the harvesters and hunting, fishing, and trapping organizations should enhance the prospects for effective resource management. That this knowledge is intimately tied to the environment, and hence any kind of resource management, specifically in terms of our way of life and the hunting, fishing, and harvesting culture, that our knowledge should play a central role in terms of renewable resource management. Furthermore, the principles and elements underscored that both Inuit traditional knowledge and scientific research are both valid systems of knowledge that should be integrated and harmonized within the context of cooperative research. Recognizing that developments were taking place all around us, often without our direct involvement and input, causing environmental degradation, that our knowledge and our contributions should be included so that managers have access to the best possible information relating to terrestrial and marine ecosystems on which to base their decisions. And significantly, that Inuit should take a lead role in the planning and undertaking of Arctic research, that we should have major and significant, if not primary, role in any undertakings concerning our knowledge and concerning research in the Arctic. And again, though these principles and elements are now possibly regarded by others as outdated, we have been consistent about these particular provisions and the substance that they reflect. Turning to international human rights and the comment I made earlier about how this early work of the Inuit Circumpolar Council has influenced an extraordinary amount of substantive work elsewhere, it can be seen in the Indigenous specific human rights work that has been undertaken at the United Nations, and specifically in the form of our involvement and direct participation at the United Nations to negotiate the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. It must also be noted that the Inuit Circumpolar Council played a direct role in the revision of International Labor Organization Convention number 107, which resulted in Convention number 169 that was adopted by the ILO plenary in 1989. More recently, in 2016, the Organization of American States adopted the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the regional human rights instrument across the Americas. In addition, there are a host of other international human rights instruments that are significant to Indigenous peoples and this element of our Indigenous knowledge. I want to anchor the discussion about Indigenous knowledge in the right of self-determination. And in order to do so, simply highlight that in 1966, the United Nations adopted the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I won't get into a long discussion about why there are two different international human rights instruments, the East versus the West and so forth, but it actually, in the discussions, it was intended that this be one particular human rights instrument that was comprehensive, but at any rate, it didn't emerge in that way. However, these two international human rights instruments, combined with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are referred to as the trilogy of instruments, or the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Human Rights within the United Nations. But here I want to underscore that these two international instruments, again, adopted in 1966, have the same Article 1. So they're referred to as the twin articles of the two covenants. The first being highly significant for a host of things, including Indigenous knowledge, that all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. It's also significant that there's reference to natural wealth and resources, as well as hunting, fishing, and harvesting activities, as noted in the second paragraph and the final sentence. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. If you think about Inuit and our way of life, This is a huge statement, and one could have a full semester-long discussion solely about this particular phrase. As well, the third paragraph indicates that state parties to the present treaties shall promote the realization of the right of self-determination and will or shall respect that right in conformity with the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations. We know that that doesn't always happen, and certainly in the case of Indigenous peoples who are under constant pressure about their basic right to life, that it doesn't happen. But it's highly significant that these two international human rights treaties underscore these important points. It's also important to recognize that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination strives to create the conditions for the full and equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all people, including racial groups or individuals belonging to distinct groups. And of course, Indigenous peoples are recognized as having a distinct status, a distinct role, and distinct rights based upon their legal status as Indigenous peoples who are different, have the right to be different, and respected as such. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is where we see the extraordinary contributions of Inuit and the original Arctic policy of the Inuit Circumpolar Council revealed. The fact that there is language there that is specific to our region and our concerns, I can't say enough about the role that was played in this particular work. Turning to Indigenous knowledge specifically, the preamble of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples indicates that recognizing that respect for Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and traditional practices contributes to sustainable and equitable development and proper management of the environment. If you think about the contemporary issues facing the world community, it seems that the rest of the world is now realizing that Indigenous peoples have the answers to many of the challenges that we face, including climate change, safeguarding biodiversity, and so forth. The right of self-determination is affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's recognized as the prerequisite for the exercise and enjoyment of all other human rights. And if you recall Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the International Covenants, this language in Article 3 that appears and is affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples mirrors that language. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. One would think that that covers everything. Nevertheless, there are 45 other articles in the UN Declaration that are all interrelated and help to ensure that this international instrument is comprehensive in nature. Significantly, Article 25 refers to the distinctive spiritual relationship that Indigenous peoples have to their lands, territories, waters, coastal seas, and other resources, and the responsibility to uphold those rights for future generations. I want to say at one stage in the negotiation of the UN Declaration, this particular article made specific reference to sea ice. But because sea ice is not universal and is not present in every ecosystem for Indigenous peoples across the globe, the term was dropped from this original provision. Article 31 is the article that elaborates more specifically on the matter of Indigenous knowledge as well as intellectual property. And people can consult the UN Declaration directly for the full text, but this is huge, a direct and specific affirmation of our right to our knowledge, as well as all of its manifestations, and our right to protect and develop intellectual property, including cultural heritage, knowledge, and cultural expressions, and the responsibility of states to take effective measures to recognize and protect the exercise of these rights. I want to point out that the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples makes reference in a number of different provisions about Indigenous knowledge. There are articles that relate to knowledge being linked to cultural identity, also referencing the importance of Indigenous knowledge to education from primary to junior high school, higher education, and throughout. The significant provision related to the protection of cultural heritage and intellectual property and how it's tied to Indigenous knowledge. Like Article 31 in the UN Declaration, the American Declaration makes specific reference through Article 14 about our right to preserve, use, develop, revitalize, and transmit to future generations our own histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, systems of knowledge, writing, literature, and so forth. And again, a state responsibility to adopt adequate and effective measures to protect the exercise of this right with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples. So if we think about Indigenous knowledge and against the backdrop of our right of self-determination and the fact that states should be giving us the intellectual and political space to ensure that we participate in measures that adequately and effectively protect the exercise of this right, you can see that many states across the globe, including the Arctic states, they haven't stepped up to the plate on this particular issue. On behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, there's been concerted effort more recently to give even greater substantive weight to the matter of Indigenous knowledge, to the extent that the ICC has adopted a definition of Indigenous knowledge. And for a host of different reasons that relate to both the substantive and procedural side of the operationalization of Indigenous knowledge, it's significant and important to agree upon what you're talking about, especially when you're engaging with third-party actors that don't fully understand the contours and the content of Indigenous knowledge. I invite participants to visit the websites of the ICC to capture this language if you choose to do so. I want to point out that in addition to the UN Declaration and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there are other treaties that are discretely focused on particular issues, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, which emerged in the Environment and Development Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Here, this particular instrument indicates that states shall respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous peoples and promote their wider application with the approval and involvement of the holders of such knowledge. We could get into a whole discussion about this CBD, but here, again, it's important that such an international instrument directly focused upon biological diversity invokes and affirms that we have rights to our knowledge and also the right to engage our knowledge holders and their involvement in work related to biological diversity. I want to point out that the ICC has also advanced Indigenous knowledge within the Arctic Council context. And in that context, a document referred to as the Ottawa Indigenous Knowledge Principles was put into place, and underscoring again that Indigenous knowledge and science are different yet complementary systems and sources of knowledge, and that it should be treated equally in the context of policy development and work of the Arctic Council. In terms of the contemporary issues and the efforts to put in place elements for the co-production of knowledge, it is very, very clear that much more work needs to be done to ensure that we effectively exercise and enjoy the rights that I've just enunciated in all of these various different instruments, and to hold the feet to the fire of those that are engaged in Arctic research and Arctic issues to, again, equitably recognize and respect Indigenous knowledge in order to achieve any effective measure of co-production of knowledge. And of course, in our view, it requires culturally appropriate methodologies as well as technology. In the end of the day, we're talking about the need for respect, for recognition, and relationships. And really at the core of much of the work that has been done on behalf of the ICC thus far, many referred to the need for trust in terms of relationships between people at the local level, within our communities, the trust, and also the realization that there is respect for and recognition of the important elements of Indigenous knowledge well before any opportunity for co-production of knowledge. And I talk about the substantive elements of Indigenous knowledge largely because it has not even been fully embraced by the world community. And it's important to recognize that substantively, Indigenous knowledge is founded in our right of self-determination. We're owners of this knowledge. These are pre-existing substantive rights, and Indigenous knowledge cannot be segregated away from this substantive right, this whole right. It can't be dealt with solely as a procedural right that's dictated by the most powerful. And oftentimes in scientific research, it is the most powerful are the ones with the most money. So I think to me, it's important that we also talk about the substantive elements of Indigenous knowledge and recognizing the important collective dimension of it, that it's sourced and pre-existing in terms of our cultural identity, as well as the power of our communities and our people to express themselves in the context of the right of self-determination in relation to their knowledge and their intellectual property. And of course, the procedural elements of Indigenous knowledge suggest that rules and guidelines or protocols for engagement of knowledge holders and Indigenous knowledge has to be developed. Indeed, the ICC is pursuing a project specific to the development of protocols for the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders. I want to conclude by indicating that this is taking hold, that traction is beginning to be realized in a number of different quarters. And I want to specifically point to the work of Inuit and Indigenous peoples generally within the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, especially when we think about how significant the impacts of climate change are in our homelands across Inuit and Untitled. Presently, through the Facilitated Working Group, which is the newest constituted body of the UNFCCC, which includes Indigenous representatives from the 7 sociocultural regions of the world. I'm fortunate to be the Arctic region representative within this facilitative working group and have advanced the idea of an activity to compile curriculum and materials that illustrate the recognition of Indigenous knowledge. It's one of the facilitative working group activities. Also, more significantly, activity 4, a series of training workshops for the UNFCCC parties. And when I say parties, I mean for state governments. When we talk about Indigenous knowledge, we have to recognize that we're the experts, we have the capacity, and state parties do not. And so the whole objective of the training workshops has been to build the capacity of state party members about Indigenous knowledge and the ethical and equitable, fair and just engagement in relation to issues concerning climate change. And so this series of training workshops will the 4th and final workshop will take place on March 25th, next week. And again, the effort being to increase the capacity of states. Too often we hear, especially from the philanthropic community and elsewhere, that our capacity needs to be developed. But in the context of Indigenous knowledge, it's fairly straightforward that we're the experts in this particular realm. I just want to conclude by indicating that other international developments have taken place where reference to Indigenous knowledge is important and significant. I've already talked about the CBD, the World Intellectual Property Organization, UNESCO's activities, a host of different things. Specific to the Arctic, I think that it's remarkable that the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement invokes the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that there's an ongoing program concerning research in the Arctic. And again, highly important that Indigenous knowledge is underscored in the context of that legally binding agreement that is specific to the Central Arctic Ocean. So those are my remarks, and I hope that I've shared something useful for the participants, and again, grateful to have been invited. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dalee. I could just listen to you all day. You have so much knowledge that it just blows one's away. So thank you very, very much for coming to share it with us.